So Congressman Honda was called to do some votes, and makes his apologies. He will be joining us as he can. My name is Jody Huckby. I'm the National Executive Director of PFLAG, Parents, Families, and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. And I wanted to thank Congressman Honda and obviously his tremendous staff for the opportunity to be here today and for their leadership. To the members of the caucus that were here earlier in the room, those who will be joining us later, and the many, as you see on the list there on the board, that could not be here, all of them are clearly sending a strong message of leadership on this issue. I'm especially honored to be representing PFLAG at this launch because the Congressional Anti-Bullying Caucus recognizes that finding solutions is not a partisan issue or a particular constituency issue, but one where we all must work together to create a different future. PFLAG is a grassroots network of over 350 chapters in all 50 states, crossing multiple generations of American families in urban centers, small cities, and in rural communities. Our network of supporters are made up of parents, families, friends, and straight allies, uniting with lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people or LGBT people to advance family acceptance, societal affirmation, and ultimately equality for all. This issue of bullying, particularly in the context of schools and its impact on the acceptance of LGBT children in schools, in their communities, in their families, in their faith communities, is a really big focus of our organization. I'm sure that my colleague, Dr. Eliza Byard, will share in the next panel some of the statistics of the disproportionate impact that bullying has on LGBT youth and the importance of enumeration in policies and in legislation. So I will leave that to her to discuss the excellent research implicit in the next panel. But allow me to point out the obvious. LGBT kids are not just LGBT. LGBT youth are African American, Asian, Hispanic, Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or Sikh. They have learning disabilities or are differently abled. LGBT youth grow up to be Democrat, Republican, independents, soldiers, public servants, successful business people, and yes, even politicians. As the opening panel for the launch of the Congressional Anti-Bullying Caucus, let me share two statistics with you that helps illustrate the scope of bullying and its impact on all people. The 2011 Youth Risk Behavior Surveillance System from the CDC indicates that nationwide 20% of all students in grades 9 through 12 experience bullying. The 2008-2009 School Crime Supplement of the National Center for Education Statistics and the Bureau of Justice Statistics indicated that nationwide 28% of students in grades 6 through 12 experience some form of bullying. PFLAG recently embarked on a major national education and awareness campaign with two corporations, Johnson & Johnson and Walgreens. The purpose is to highlight the work of PFLAG, including our work educating communities, as well as our work in helping to create safer schools and the problem of bullying that exists. We'd like to think that one of the reasons that the corporations chose us as their partner is that PFLAG has always recognized that while the LGBT population has particular concerns that need to be acknowledged and addressed, the issue of cultivating respect for all people is not one-dimensional, and that the way PFLAG has been working for over 40 years now, finding common ground is how we create a world that respects differences but does not accept bullying on any terms. It is important to note, and you will hear more from our panel, that bullying can happen to anyone and affects all individuals. It's unwanted aggressive behavior that involves a real or a perceived power imbalance, that behavior is repeated or has the potential to be repeated over time, and it manifests itself as verbal, social, and/or physical. The impact it has on people who are bullied, what it reveals about people who do the bullying, these are issues that we need to pay attention to and to address. Our organization is celebrating its 40th anniversary this week. Jean Manford, PFLAG's founder, witnessed her adult son being a victim of a hate crime. But what galvanized her to action was that the legal and societal environment not only accepted it, but in large part condoned it. The climate that is created by bullying and the sad reality of the devastating impact it can have from death by suicide, such as what Tina Long and David shared, are what we know happened to Lance Corporal Harry Liu. It must stop. That is why we're all here and why the Congressional Anti-Bullying Caucus is so important. I'm pleased to share this panel this afternoon with a distinguished group of individuals. Now, their profiles and the organizations they represent can be found in the information that's been distributed. So in the interest of time, I'll ask each of them to welcome, to say hello, and to say a few brief remarks. And we'll start with Dr. Joseph Wright, Senior Vice President of the Child Health Advocacy Institute, the Children's National Medical Center, and a board-appointed member of the American Academy of Pediatrics Committee on Emergency Medicine. Dr. Wright.
Thank you, Jody. And I just want to state this afternoon, pediatrics this afternoon, 60,000 pediatricians in this country who promote the health and well-being of children wherever they are. But my day-to-day work is as a pediatric emergency physician. And a decade ago, when I began to dig into the reasons that young people were appearing before me in my practice, I really began to understand the impact that bullying and retaliation had on the physical injuries that were presenting to the emergency department where I work here in Washington, D.C. And over the course of the last decade, not just the impact on the physical well-being of young people, but what has really begun to concern me more than anything else is the long-term behavioral health impact. We're just now beginning to understand in this country the insidious nature of the impact of bullying on behavioral and mental health. We have not had the benefit of long-term, longitudinal studies to understand the impact that young people take into adulthood, of the impact and the effects of bullying. And the thing as a pediatrician that really is striking to me is the gender distinction in the way that young people manifest the impact of bullying, specifically the impact on young girls and how that impacts their well-being as they move into adolescence and adulthood. At a societal level, I am struck by the pervasiveness of the issue. Jody's already quoted you a statistic, but let me take that one step further. When you add in the number of children who are exposed, either as victims, bullies, or bystanders, fully 3/4 of children are in third grade, are part of what we call the bullying circle, have been exposed. And the pervasiveness of an issue of this magnitude cannot be ignored, and that's why it's so great that we're all here today. The other thing at a societal level that I'm struck by as I move around the country and speak, especially to peers, is that the learning curve is steep. We'll hear in another panel later on about what adults can do, but let me just channel what Katie said in the previous session, that this is an activation moment. Young people are leading the way on this, and it's the adults that need to catch up. And this is a wonderful, wonderful opportunity in this country to have young people lead the way. The fact that the film Bully is something that is accessible to the folks who are most well positioned to move this issue forward is very gratifying, and I'm glad to be a part of it. And again, I just thank you for having us represent here on behalf of American Academy of Pediatrics this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright. And to your left, Aaron Tax, the Director of Federal Government Relations for the Services and Advocacy for GLBT Elders, also known as SAGE. Aaron.
All right, thanks very much, Jody. And I really appreciate the opportunity to be here today to talk about the unique issue of older adults who in fact face bullying in our country. And I'd like to start with a short anecdote. This is from a few months ago when I was up at a senior center up in New York City, and I was watching people gather together for the meal times. It was around 4 o'clock, granted. They're getting together for their meal time, and I saw people getting together at a table, and I saw some folks telling other folks they couldn't sit at the table with them. And I immediately thought this looks exactly like high school, because, fast forward many years. And in fact, there really are many parallels to younger generations and bullying, but there are pronounced differences that arise from the unique physical, psychological, and contextual consequences of growing older. And there are certainly the extreme stories. There's one out there of a 98-year-old woman who killed her 100-year-old roommate because she was taking over too much space in the room. But I think far more common than that are the stories that happen every day of people from being blocked and sitting at a card table or a bingo table or at a dinner table. And these things might be easy to belittle, but for a lot of people, these are very important parts of their day. This is something they look forward to, and the one time they might have a chance to have interaction with other older adults. So it does have a big impact on these folks. Where does this most often take place? Most typically in communal settings. like nursing homes, long-term care facilities, retirement communities, senior centers, so on and so forth? And how often does it take place? There are statistics that between 10 and 20% of folks living in a group living situation have experienced peer bullying, and that number translated goes into the hundreds of thousands. And I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to saying more later on.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Next, we have Lara Schwartz, Vice President of External Relations to the American Association of People with Disabilities. Laura.
Good afternoon. First of all, I just think we all need to take a moment to express a debt of gratitude to Congressman Honda and his staff. They've stepped out. We do need changes in the law, very much, but as much as anything, we need heroes. He is an authentic hero, and as we combat bullying, it's just important that we have people to look to and say, there is someone standing there with us. Now, people with disabilities can be heroes and are, but too often we're portrayed as victims. We're victims of some disease, some disaster, some accident of birth that caused us to have a disability. People with disabilities often look different, often isolated from our peers. Many schools have only one student in a wheelchair. Many neighborhoods have only one resident who has Down syndrome. They might seem more different than they are, and often they seem like easy prey. Now, bullying happens when we don't see our fellow human beings for who they are, but for what we think is different about them, and what we think we can get away with doing to them. First and foremost, AAPD is combating bullying by showing people with disabilities as we really are, powerful, valued, complete members of our communities and schools. Our 30 seconds public service announcement, which featured real students with disabilities saying, "I am not going to be bullied," expresses our conviction that bullying ends where mutual respect begins. That's why we encourage people with disabilities and our friends and families to share our stories of courage and self-determination. We also work alongside legislators to enact robust protections for everyone. We again thank Congressman Honda and the entire membership of this caucus. You are sending a strong message just like ours. None of us is going to be bullied.
Thank you very much, Laura. And last, we have Michael Lieberman, the Washington Counsel for the Anti-Defamation League and Director of ADL Civil Rights Policy Planning Center. Michael.
Thanks, Jody. Good afternoon, everyone. I always feel as an advocate, I'm Michael Lieberman, the Washington Counsel for the Anti-Defamation League, and I always feel as an advocate that it's constitutionally required of me to take my jacket off and roll up my sleeves, so that's what I've done. I hope you're familiar with the work of the Anti-Defamation League. If you have 2 minutes and a guy sitting in the front row holding up a sign that says 1 minute, 30 seconds, that kind of thing, you cannot talk as much as you would want about the work that the League has done on this issue, so let me direct you to our website, www.adl.org, for the League's holistic approach to assessment, education, prevention, and advocacy. I want to start and end my comments with thanks to the founders, to the members of this Congressional Anti-Bullying Caucus. It's an excellent time for Congress to, in a bipartisan way, elevate the involvement on this issue. We know a lot about bullying. We know a lot about the impact of bullying. We know very, very little about the demographics of bullying. Because of the great work of Jody and his colleagues at PFLAG, because of the great work of GLSEN and their National School Climate Survey, we know a considerable amount about bullying against LGBT, very, very little about bullying against Jews, against Sikh Americans, against African Americans, against Hispanics, against Asians, against Muslims. That should be something that the caucus is involved in. Some of you know about this 60-page background report the GAO did for Congress on bullying. There are exactly 4 recommendations in this 60-page single-spaced document, but one of them is we need to know more about bias-based bullying and the demographics of bullying. What we do know from the National Crime Victimization Survey, from CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey, is very, very disturbing. Disproportionate numbers of bullying incidents against individuals on the basis of their race, religion. I was privileged to participate in the Sikh Coalition, the Japanese American Citizens League, and the Organization of Chinese Americans Leadership conferences this year, and all of them had as a priority matter this issue. It is something that matters a lot. We only know the answers to these questions when two things happen in a high-profile context. One is a tragic suicide, like what Jody has mentioned, Marine Lance Corporal Harry Liu, Army Private Danny Chen. What is happening in the military to address that? That's one way we hear about things. And the other way is high-profile enforcement actions from the Department of Education or the Department of Justice, that when things become a federal case, like what happened in South Philadelphia in 2009, when 13 Asian Pacific American students were sent to the hospital in the aftermath of a series of bullying, really tends to get our attention. But knowing more should be a priority for this caucus.
Thank you very much, Michael. So in the time remaining for this panel, we have a question for each of our panelists to hopefully spur some thoughts and conversation, and we'll open up for Q&A. Dr. Wright, I'd like to start with you. Could you speak about the long-term impacts, the physical, mental, and societal, that you've seen bullying play, and why it's so important to prevent and address this issue?
Well, I mentioned in my opening remarks that the issue about the health outcomes of bullying that are most disturbing and that we should be most concerned about are behavioral health impacts. Because the impact of indirect bullying is insidious. It's often hard to appreciate, hard to see. As was mentioned, can go on under the radar. And the research is telling us that the impacts of this kind of bullying behavior tends to have a long-lasting effect on into adulthood. And lastly, the issue that is of great concern is the way that the gender expression seems to differentiate young women from young men. Secondly, I'd also just like to point something out as a pediatrician on the panel. We think in terms of development, child development, and I mentioned to you a statistic about children in third grade, and the fact that the overall majority at that point are exposed in one way or another. So that it becomes secondary prevention. What we're all talking about here is what we need to do in terms of secondary prevention. The behavior is already safe. And I want to mention as part of this panel that an approach that I think we all need to take around bullying is that we can talk about primary prevention. It requires digging down to elementary age children, preschool children, parents, but this is where we need to also incorporate activity around prevention, primary prevention, really getting ahead of the issue before it sets in as part of child development. There has been some activity. I'll just mention Sesame Street for one. Last October did launch a campaign aimed at primary prevention. But I just want to make sure that we all are cognizant this affects people across the age spectrum, as you've heard. But the place to begin is really with very young children and parents, and bringing adults and parents up that learning curve about this issue.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright. So we heard Tina and David Long speak earlier at the beginning of the caucus about the challenges that they had with their son, Tyler, who had Asperger's. Laura, would you address the issue of bullying and how you see its impact playing out on people with disabilities?
Absolutely. For people with disabilities, as I mentioned, there could be some isolation within one's classroom. One of the benefits of the last 22 years of the ADA is that segregation in education is no longer the norm and what one can expect. The challenge that comes along with this is that a person who has Asperger's, who uses a wheelchair, who is blind or deaf or has any disability at all, may find herself to be the only one in the class who has that characteristic. She might be the only person in the class who uses an aid or a particular accommodation. Now, for those of us who are parents of small children or have been or have younger siblings, this seems to be a youngish crowd, anything different is very, very interesting to young kids. And there's a moment, there's a flash point when different goes from wow to wow, I could really take advantage of this. And it's young. I think it's around first grade. Honestly, I think our pediatrician panelists could point to the exact developmental moment. But the challenge that a student faces at that age is coming into a school environment where right from the get-go, respect and frankly openness are the norm. I think for too long, the sensibility around kids and adults with disabilities is, look, just don't scare, this person doesn't want to be embarrassed by your extra attention. And that's not bad advice walking down the street, but it's terrible advice for children who haven't decided what to think yet. Just like, we can't talk about children with two dads, you know, what will they think? They'll think it's fine, don't be afraid. So I think that's the challenge a child like Tyler faced, and that's frankly, you know, one thing that I'm really gratified to see about this caucus is the focus additionally on elder citizens and adults. If you are the only person in your workplace who has Down syndrome, you know, you might really face some challenges like the person at the lunch table did that you were describing. And coming into an environment where people understand who you are not afraid to ask questions about what they don't understand, and someone has your back at the top, it's just critical.
Thank you very much, Laura. Aaron, we've seen an increase, obviously, in the last few years in the media attention to and coverage of bullying of younger people, its impact. But much less attention as we focus on older adults. Would you talk a bit more about the vulnerability of older adults and as it relates to bullying?
Sure, and I think an important place to start is look at the context in which this is by and large happening. And these are these communal sorts of settings. And I think we can first look at the bullies, who they are and why they're doing this. And many of these folks are at a time in their lives and they're redefining their identities. And then along with that comes a lot of fear. It's a time of a lot of loss related to aging, so loss of control that leads to powerlessness, a loss of independence, loss of relationships, loss of income, and a loss of valued goals in the lives that they've led. And these losses are especially pronounced in these long-term care settings where people do feel powerlessness and are seeking some sort of control. In addition to that, these are folks who might not be accustomed to living with people who are different than them for a variety of reasons, whether it's sexual orientation, race, religion, or disabilities. And then you can look at the victims and the intersection of what they're going through and what older people face, whether it's physical or mental disabilities. And I think one good example of this is dementia and how that impacts whether people are being bullied. So this might, if someone has dementia, they might be someone who seems particularly vulnerable and someone who might be picked on in that sort of setting. And in addition to that, you might think about, well, how do we solve that type of bullying situation if someone has dementia? And in that situation, typically people might be provided assertiveness training or some sort of other way to deal with the bullying. But unfortunately, with someone in a certain stage of dementia, they might not be able to learn new skills. So you would think that really changes how someone's going to interact in that sort of environment. And that's just one example of the many examples that are out there of how aging intersects with bullying. It impacts not only why people are bullied, but how we can react to it.
Thank you very much, Eric. Before we turn it over to questions, one last Q&A, we have one last question. Michael, we heard how bullying impacts a broad range of people. But let me ask you, what do you think we can really expect from the creation of a Congressional Anti-Bullying Caucus, from government leaders, government leadership, moving forward in addressing the challenges of bullying as pervasive as it is?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Jody. I think it's essential for members and advocates to have very, very high hopes for this caucus, but we have to be realistic. We cannot legislate bullying out of existence. And so Congress must be creative and thoughtful, and members must be creative and thoughtful about what to do. Inclusive anti-bullying legislation should be included in Elementary and Secondary Education Act, in the Higher Education Act when it gets reauthorized. We should ask the military to examine their training. We should fund anti-bias and bullying prevention initiatives. We can identify best practices. We can do oversight of enforcement actions by the Department of Education and the Department of Justice. But finally, it's great that this caucus is being launched with an equal focus on cyberbullying. Congress can ask and people will respond from Sesame Street, from Cartoon Network, from MTV, from Facebook, from Nickelodeon, from YouTube, from Twitter, and from, obviously, Hollywood. When Congress asks them to be involved, we have to meet students and young people where they are. And let me end as I began. Thank you for the leadership, Congressman Honda. This is not just a one-day media event. We don't look at it that way, neither should you. And know that if you build this anti-bullying caucus with a nice little logo and a hashtag, that advocates and stakeholders and parents will rely on you. And we will come and we will say things like, what's next? What else? Why not? How soon? And how can we help? Thanks to the members of the caucus for what you do today and what you will do in the future.
Being moderator, I'm going to take the liberty of see if the audience has just one question before we transition to the next panel. Well, oh yes, we do have a question. Second one, please.
I'm curious about what, this is for any of the panelists who are interested in answering the question. What do you think the role of curriculum is in preventing bullying and preventing suicide?
St. Helens. Lara?
I do think it plays a role. One thing that I think is incredibly important to a school investigating, creating a curriculum, and I would like to see people look more heavily to some of the things that are coming out of the studies and are coming out of, for instance, the Department of Education. Starting on the wrong foot, as you define bullying, is incredibly confusing to kids. If you don't have something age appropriate and really is bullying, you're sending them down the wrong path. I'm actually outing my child's school. When they were told, you know, not letting somebody play with you is bullying, well, sometimes you're not friends with everybody. And it honestly, it took forever to pull my kid out of that. I think curriculum is important, but I actually think that we need to spend much more time on risk assessment. It tells you what you need to be doing and where and when from the outset. And I don't know if people have pens, but I'd recommend some of the writings of Dewey Cornell, who's a professor at the University of Virginia.
Dr. Wright, last one.
Jody, again, on the theme of learning curve, only half of the states in this country have a provision, a requirement for professional development for educators on this issue. So in addition to curriculum that is aimed at young people, I believe that curriculum learning aimed at adults who are with our children each and every day is also an important and a low-cost approach to the issue. So along the theme of the Congresswoman, this is something that doesn't cost a lot of money and something that needs to be done.
Thank you very much. Obviously, our esteemed panelists could talk for hours and hours, but we're not going to. But obviously, you want to track these folks down. If you don't have information, and we all have business cards. I'd like to thank Joe Wright, Lara Schwartz, Aaron Tax, and Michael Lieberman for the time you spent with us today on this very important issue. And again, thank you to Congressman Honda and his excellent staff for coordinating today's